Hey there, YouTube. Twofinger here. Sorry about the background noise. That's my $10 tube amp. It's a stereo 3-watt tube amplifier. Uses two 50EH5 tubes. Paid $6.99 for this. It was a Philco Model K 1422 turntable that had the drive mechanism was completely gone. It was shot. The speakers were dry rotted with really basically nothing there. First off, unless you've been trained to work with high voltages, you're not allowed to even consider this project because there's lethal voltage inside these old tube circuits and you will kill yourself. So I'm not recommending that anyone do this unless they have been trained for working with tube circuits, specifically for rehousing and repairing tube circuits. So here's what you need to do. You need to find yourself, for cheap, like a table radio, a record player, a reel-to-reel, oftentimes the old reel-to-reels, unless they say solid state on them. And usually you can determine fairly quickly if it's a tube device, how it will take a while to heat up. There'll be heating vents on the back up, and you can look in there and see that it's lighting up. And oftentimes it will tell you what the replacement tubes are if you start snooping around on the bottom, or they have these little panels that pop off on those old things that they used to hold the cables and stuff, and there'll be a little panel with the schematic in there, and that'll show you everything. It'll tell you the wattage of the tubes, and they did it right back in the old days. It's all point-to-point hand-wired stuff. But here's what you're going to need to do. You're going to need to install a properly grounded power cord, a 3-wire cord, because the old ones, they're all set up with these 2-wire cords, and that's a shock hazard. So we need to properly ground it out, install a 3-wire cord, and that's basically cutting the old power cord off of the inlet where it comes in. There'll be a binding post type of thing where it hooks up, and a lot of times the third post is there with the wire attached to it going to the chassis ground. So then you need to get, like, let's say a computer cable. You snip the one end off of it, the end that doesn't plug into the wall, and then strip that back. You'll see there's a green wire, a white wire, and a black wire. You have to be kind of trained to do this stuff to know which one is which and which goes where. But after you figure that out, you run that green wire to the chassis ground, and that's what you need to do. Step 2 is to determine, does it have a fuse? If it doesn't have a fuse, you need to cut a fuse in. That's another safety feature to protect your equipment and yourself, because there are lethal voltages in this. I'm pleading with you, please, if you don't know what you're doing, stay away from tube circuits. So yeah, you need to fuse it. And as far as determining the value of the fuse, that's something you're going to need to do your research on, because if it's too high of a value, it's not going to be doing you any favors. If it's too low of a fuse, it's going to blow when you crank it. So that's typically my rule of thumb. If you're a goof like me, you could start off with some real low values of fuses and then abuse the circuit. One way is to look at other similar circuits and what they're rated at, or other circuits that use that same tube, and what type of fuse do they use. Generally, you need to rehouse it, and then the last thing you'll find is you'll be running it and everything sounds great, and then the song will stop and you hear this hum, and it's pretty loud. That will be the filter capacitors are shot. And oftentimes, back where you look where the tubes are, like in my case on this amp, there's 2 small tubes. They're like that big, and they're 1.5 or 1.25 watts each. So this is like a 3-watt tube amp. I can crank it on my patio with small, inefficient speakers, and it won't really bother the neighbors, If I had some efficient speakers and cranked it and I was slamming it, yeah, it would bother the neighbors. But this is perfect because you can get 2 breakup with it, and it's not that loud. I have a pair of monoblock amps that are 7.5 watts that are really nice. And then I've got like an old, like German Grundig, like a table style radio. It was actually in like a living room chassis, like a big thing. And that one's 5 watts, and man, it sounds really good with a clean guitar. Doesn't take pedals so well. I got to figure something out with a preamp for that. But again, like with this, I could take my Korg Pandora or something like a Zoom or a Pod and put that in front of this and use that as the preamp. So another thing that I find is running an EQ in front of it. Like I built a little stereo EQ that's in a pedal chassis that runs two 9-volt batteries, and that's really cool. If you take like a Walkman or your MP3 player, and you run a cable out of that going into this stereo little EQ that I made that has 4 controls: gain, bass, mid-range, and treble. You can really get it to sound way better. So any type of EQ before it will work as a preamp or as a front end, because you may find it a little lacking in volume, in the output of the volume. I mean, this is set up to run off of a phono cartridge, so the impedance isn't exactly correct. Now, like on this one, the schematic was actually on the device. On the bottom of on the inside of the chassis, there was like a piece of paper with like a photocopy of the schematic. You know, I could probably fix this because the song would end and you'd hear this really loud hum. And that wasn't noticeable when the music was playing, but when it got quiet, you would really notice this hum. So I'm like, that's got to be the filter caps, right? So I looked into it, and there were some older guys that knew what they were doing that said when they designed these things, they picked the rating of the capacitors not so much by an electronical formula, but it was by size and what they could afford. And they said if going down in value isn't good, because you can run into compression and motorboating or something, like you didn't want to go down in value. And this is on the microfarads. Always have to keep the voltage right or up. You know, like if it says it's rated at 150 volts, you got to use 150 volts. You can't use 100. It'll blow. Or, 200 volts is fine, 300, 450, as long as it's above what it's rated at originally. When you're replacing the cap, you have to at least go above on the voltage, or meet it. You can't go below. But on the microfarad size, in this case, I went above. And how I went about the process of fixing it, what this video, the main point of it is, because I think most people are aware. People that would have the capability to do this are aware that you need to ground it out with a 3-wire cord and put a fuse in it. But the filter cap thing was something I was kind of aware of. Now I went through the process. There's nothing to it. And the fact that you don't have to exactly nail the cap ratings was encouraging to me, because I ordered them. I ordered ratings that were very close. So the black wire was a common ground. And then the red wire going in was for the 150 microfarad, and the blue wire was for the 30 microfarad. Now, I ordered that stuff from China, and I'm waiting around. Of course, the 30 microfarad didn't come. And the tracking number looks like it's bogus. I went ahead and dug through my old capacitors, and I got one that came out of a disposable camera. It was rated as a 55 microfarad, 300 volt, and I cut that in there, and it works fine. There's no hum. So going smaller would cause these unpleasant artifacts, such as, I forget, motorboating or something nasty that you didn't want. It wasn't motorboating, but you could go up. He said going up increases the bass response, and it just all depends. If you're going up, it could alter the performance of the amplifier. So it's all up to your particular taste of your particular amp. For me, I almost doubled the HFE ratings on the one side. The high side, I think it was 150 volts. And I mounted that right on there. Like this big can thing, it's right in the middle of the 2 tubes. I unriveted that, I drilled those rivets out, pulled it off of there, and then I desoldered the tabs on the bottom of it and straightened them out. And there was a heavy-duty, like phenolic paper gasket that came off. And I hot glued that capacitor to that gasket, and then used a self-tapper on one side, a screw with a fastener on the other side, because there was a little bracket that held another double cap. And those are 20 microfarad, 150 volts. It's a double cap, so I don't think I'm going to actually be replacing that because I can't hear any hum. You got to be careful. It's old. This is fragile stuff. Mine has two little output transformers, one mounted on each side. It's the cutest little amp. But like I said, if you're having a hum, look at where the tubes go in, and there might be this aluminum looking. It just looks like the diameter of a D battery. It's bigger than a tube in the diameter, maybe a little taller. It's just like a tubey thing with the flat roof on it, and it'll have some writing on there. If you read that writing, oftentimes it'll say right on it, red is, 470 UF at 150 volts. Green is 150 UF at 150 volts. Yellow is 30 microfarad UF at 150 volts, and black is common. So then that's 3 capacitors inside that whole thing. So some guys, they want it to be preserved, so they'll unrivet that, they'll drill those rivets out, take that thing out of there, and then they'll pry all of the material that's inside of there. You'll drill it out and clean it, scrape it all out of there. And there's like PCBs in there. Like I tried on mine, I got almost all of it out. I had a mask on, and it was nasty. I wouldn't want to do it again. You know what I ended up, for me, my second capacitor, the smaller value one, was almost like a cigarette. It was like about a third, half the length of a Marlboro. So I put that inside because it fit inside the little chassis. The chassis is like a little box, a little rectangular box. It fit inside of there, no problem. And then, like I said, I hot glued the larger capacitor, which was like about the size of a D battery cut in half. So I just hot glued that onto that gasket and put that back into place with some fasteners and called it a day. The main points that I wanted to go back and review is you have to have a grounded cable on there, 3-wire cord. You have to have a fuse. You really should have a power switch on it too. So you're going to need to rehouse that thing. So in the process, you do all of that. And then once you go through all that and you're testing it up, you fire it up and you find that there's hum, you need to look into replacing those filter caps. And I would start with the big large thing. It's on the outside. So if you can't find the information out by any kind of paperwork or diagram that came with the device, if you have a model number, I encourage you to take a look on the internet. Oftentimes you could find the schematic or someone in a forum who figured it out. So there's always, where there's a will, there's a way. And in replacing those capacitors, modern capacitors are really a lot more efficient. It's just obtaining them. So if you find that your value is an unusual value that they don't make anymore, I wouldn't so much get hung up on it. And I was talking about not wanting to go down because you could run into some unpleasant artifacts going down in value. Well, that isn't so much if it's, let's say it's 3 or like 7 or something. If it's a small amount, I'm talking about going down by like doubling it. Because in do-it-yourself electronics, there's always a 30% leeway of tolerance in the values of the parts that we use. So that's something to consider right there. I was kind of going a little bit out of bounds, subbing in a 55 for a 30. But it ended up working out fine. I've been running this amp for 2 hours now. It sounds fantastic and there's no hum. So that was my $10 tube amp. This one cost me $6.99. The mono blocks that I have, those are beautiful amps. You can convert those into recording preamps. They're sought after. They're beautiful amps, 7.5 watts a side. They're much louder than this. The mono block, the really nice one that I've got in the other room, that one I paid $5 for. It was in a reel-to-reel machine with the same thing. All the dry rotted out with a bad motor. Nothing like picking up a stereo tube amp for under $10. Now, I had to look for a long time to do that, but I'm telling you, don't turn your nose up at any of those really old record players that look like they're from the 60s or the 50s, because I'm telling you, I'm sure I've turned my nose up at them before, not thinking that, you know what, there's a little tube amp in there. So from now on, I am going to be buying every one that I see that has the tubes in them and converting them, because with a little bit of work, you can get creative and make a nicer setup than I did. I mean, I mounted mine on some boards with rubber feet and with some cheap hardware on there. It's really not that nice what I did. But if I was going to do it again, I would definitely go out of my way to improve the chassis and make it something really a huge step up from what I slapped together on this one. Thank you for tuning in with me once again. Peace.